A world without video games is easier to imagine for the folks who actually didn't have video games in their world, like talking about the internet or cell phones. But for a growing number of people out there, a world without video games would feel rather strange. And yet in the early 80s, that almost happened. In America, that is. Console gaming soared in the 70s and early 80s, only to come crashing down. But when the smoke had cleared, one company with one of the most iconic video game franchises of all time was able to revive the market and then proceed to dominate it. For years, the name Nintendo and video games were synonymous. But just before the 80s exit stage left, there was a challenger to Nintendo's dominance of the American video game market. A contender that took on a juggernaut that gave us the blue blur of Sonic and carved itself a rather large piece of the pie. Before these two companies finished duking it out, the mark that they would leave on the world of video games would remain for generations, arguably leading directly to the current video game landscape we see today. But even though the console war started more in the 90s, the seeds of all of it were sowed a bit earlier than that. The video game crash of 1983. Video games can point rather far back into the history of electronics to talk about their origins, but it was in the late 70s, early 80s that home consoles were becoming the new standard for video games. Starting with the 1977 release of the Atari 2600, originally named the Atari Video Computer System, sales for home console games were a modest market that didn't see much growth for a few years. But when Atari was able to license Space Invaders in 1980, sales of the console and game quadrupled, becoming the first video game to sell 1 million units. Seeing this radical growth, many companies viewed the budding video game market as the next big money market. Odyssey 2, Intellivision, ColecoVision, and Vectrex all found themselves entering the market before 1982, with Atari releasing the 5200 practically in response. ColecoVision appeared to be catching up to Atari's 58% hold in the market, with claiming 17% within about a year after its release. Initially, this rapid growth looked like it was going to go to the moon, but there were some issues arising that had yet to get ironed out. For example, while the number of systems created a wide variety of experiences, many of the systems had full catalogs of games that were exclusive to their home system. A bit of that practice still happens today, but we can thank third-party publishers for being able to bridge that gap. But before 1982, manufacturers of the systems were the only publishers of those games, limiting the possibility of cross-platform gaming. When a group of 4 Atari programmers left the company to start Activision in 1979, the toothpaste was squeezed out of the tube. Because the programmers were familiar with both the programming and cartridge manufacturing process, they were able to create products that would still be compatible with the console. Not long after Activision entered the fray, Atari slapped them with a lawsuit, alleging the 4 programmers stole company secrets and violated NDAs. Still, they ultimately wouldn't get Activision to cease and desist their production of the games and cartridges. The lawsuit was settled in 1982, with Activision paying a percentage of the royalties to Atari to continue producing games for the system. And despite the lawsuit, Activision was producing games throughout the entire proceedings, gaining a tremendous foothold in the market. With the resolution of the Activision and Atari lawsuit in 1982, the floodgates opened for third-party developers. Prior to the settlement, Activision was one of a handful of third-party publishers before that number ballooned as more and more companies entered the market. And while this may seem a boon at first, it quickly became apparent that Activision was working with tools that other publishers didn't quite have. What made Activision so successful was that the programmers were already very aware of the strengths and limitations of the Atari 2600, having worked for the company previously and in a similar capacity. But these new publishers based their ability to create by poaching programmers from other companies or stealing industrial secrets as a whole. Because of this lack of institutional memory, many of the games stank. Like they were really, really bad. Ask a video game nerd about E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and you will hear a harrowing tale of a game so bad that millions of remaining copies were found in a New Mexico landfill. So with this flood of crappy video games on too many systems, consumers didn't want to keep buying all the necessary components to maybe have an okay experience, when a lot of it was costly and the quality just wasn't there. By 1983, the home console market in America had collapsed. But this crash was not felt worldwide. Japan was another video game crazy country, with the majority of its interest aimed at arcades. Around the same time the US home console market was hitting bottom like a sack of wet cement, Japanese video game makers saw an opportunity and pivoted from arcades to developing home consoles. Just 1 month into 1983, 3 companies produced home consoles set to be released in Japan, including the 2 that would be the main belligerents of the console wars. And with many American companies, like Atari and Mattel, having to recover domestic losses, these companies would essentially go unchallenged for the next few years in Japan. Having an open field and significant control over the quality of their games, a former playing card company would be considered the gold standard of video games for the rest of the 1980s. Ready Player One. Nintendo seemed an unlikely candidate to be the leading video game producer by 1983. Founded in 1889 to produce Hanafuda cards, which was one of the few forms of gambling still allowed in Japan at the time. For the next 60 years, the company was passed down from founder Fusajiro Yamauchi to his son-in-law Sekirio Kaneda, who would also take the last name Yamauchi. With not a lot changing about the company except expanding operations, Sekirio would later hand the company over to his grandson, Hiroshi Yamauchi, in 1949. After a visit to the United States Playing Card Company, the dominant manufacturer of cards in the US, in 1956, Yamauchi knew he needed to shift Nintendo away from playing cards after seeing the Cincinnati company's operation take up no more than a small office space. The visit displayed the limitations of playing card market to Yamauchi. So by 1966, the company began to dabble with toys and electronics, especially since the Hanafuda market had become oversaturated with the economic boom of the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo. This move wasn't necessarily the masterstroke that Yamauchi thought it would be. The market for toys at this time was rather small and already dominated by Bandai and Tomy. But it did introduce the practice of moving items at a quicker rate since the product life of toys was usually short. Nintendo would get its first big hit with the Ultra Hand, an extendable hand toy that was designed by maintenance engineer Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi had originally created the Ultra Hand prototype as a bit of tomfoolery, which Yamauchi had seen when visiting one of the Hanafuda factories. Yamauchi saw potential in Yokoi, giving him a position in product development and tasking him to refine the Ultra Hand for the upcoming Christmas season. If Yokoi didn't create the Ultra Hand, most likely out of boredom, there's a high chance that Nintendo wouldn't have been able to survive their slump. Gunpei Yokoi had an electrical engineering background, which he used to develop other successful toys, like the 10 billion barrel puzzle, the Ultra Machine, a baseball throwing contraption, and a love tester. In 1970, Nintendo released the first solar-powered light gun, the Nintendo Beam Gun, produced in partnership with Sharp. This would be the prototype for the Zapper accessory for the Famicom. 2 years later, the world was introduced to the first home video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey. With the release of this system, Nintendo initiated its first involvement with video games by producing a light gun accessory that would be used with the Odyssey. By 1974, Nintendo acquired the rights to distribute the Odyssey in Japan before releasing its first arcade game, EVR Race, a year later. And with the release of the Color TV Game 6 and the Color TV Game 15 in 1977, Nintendo was officially in the video game business. The video game division of Nintendo would go on to produce some of the most famous and popular video games in history. Of course, this was helped along by a young upstart designer named Shigeru Miyamoto. Joining the company in 1977, Miyamoto would assist with the design of the arcade game Sheriff before he would go on to create the first in a long string of video game franchise royalty. Donkey Kong, which was released in 1981, was not only popular in arcades, but had enough of a pull to hop onto the earlier home consoles like the Atari 2600. The same thing would happen for other games like Donkey Kong Jr., Sky Skipper, Mario Bros., and Donkey Kong 3. And despite the success Nintendo was seeing in arcades, the company shifted more and more of its focus onto the home game market. With Gunpei Yokoi as the lead designer, Nintendo released the first handheld electronic game line called Game & Watch in 1981. The Game & Watch was a success, leading Yamauchi aiming the company more and more at portable and home gaming consoles. By the fall of 1985, Nintendo had given up arcade production in Japan. Of course, why continue to worry about single-game arcade cabinets when just 2 years prior, the company released a system that could run hundreds of quality games in the comfort of someone's own home. The Family Computer, or Famicom, was introduced to Japan in July of 1983. Nintendo was still in the planning stages of an international release. Seeing the writing on the wall from across the Pacific, see the crash of 1983, Nintendo held off with the release of the system in the States. The Famicom sold more than 500,000 units in the first month of its release. Just 1 year after its release, 2.5 million units of the system had been sold in the Japanese market, easily outselling Sega SG-1000, which was released the same year. Bolstered by quite a showing of sales in Japan, Nintendo brass thought about taking another swing at the American market, despite some deep skepticism of the video game press and video game companies. But for the next 2 years, Nintendo laid the framework for the limited launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. It was still a pretty big risk, with Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa betting the house. In order to get retailers, who were still a bit skittish from the crash, to stock the systems and games, Arakawa allowed retailers to pay nothing upfront and return any unsold products within a 90-day period, essentially placing any monetary risk on Nintendo instead of themselves. The gamble paid off with getting the NES on the shelves, with one retailer letting Nintendo know that, quote, "It's your funeral." Sales really didn't pick up for the NES until they expanded the markets they were selling in by 1986, with markets like LA, Chicago, and San Francisco on the horizon. And at the same time, another video game company was making a run at the US market, although not nearly as successful as Nintendo. Yet. While Nintendo was making waves with the NES, Sega released its own 8-bit console in the US with the Master System. Sega and Nintendo had been rivals back in Japan when the Famicom was first released, but Sega's system at the time, the SG-1000, really didn't have the same effect as Nintendo's did. And while Sega had hoped a technically comparable system to the Famicom/NES would give them a fighting chance in the open market, sales of the system had been fair, but nothing to really write home about. But it was their arcades and coin-operated entertainment that was the real moneymaker for the company. Considering that Sega was started as a coin-operating entertainment machine producer in the 1940s, this was well-treaded water for them. Starting off making slot machines and jukeboxes, Sega would go through a litany of names and owners before there was even the concept of a video game. But the pieces that set Sega up to become a contender finally happened in 1979, when Sega, helmed by David Rosen, acquired the company Esco Boyuki specifically to enlist founder and owner Hayao Nakayama into a management role. At that time, the company was called Sega Enterprises Limited, and Nakayama served as executive vice president and shared leadership responsibilities. In this position, Nakayama was specifically in charge of the company's sales, marketing, and R&D, a role that would become even more imperative in the coming decades. After the release of Head On, which introduced the Eat the Dots gameplay that would be used for Pac-Man, Sega was confident in the budding arcade market, while also licensing and releasing Frogger. By 1982, a downturn in the arcade business led Sega's parent company, Gulf and Western, to sell the North American manufacturing organization and licensing rights to Bally. They still held on to the R&D operations in North America, as well as Sega Enterprises Limited, its Japanese subsidiary. This was when Nakayama, now president of Sega Enterprises, advocated for the company to use the hardware knowledge and expertise they had to enter the home console market in Japan, leading to the development and release of the SG-1000.
In the years after its release, the SG-1000 was able to show that the market was set for home consoles, especially considering that it sold more than its projected 50,000 units by 110,000. By 1984, the Famicom began to take the lead in sales, much to the large game library from third-party developers, of course with Nintendo-esque caveats. The plan was less savory to Sega, considering that many of these developers were competitors in the arcade market. In November of 1983, David Rosen would step down as president of Sega Enterprises and took on a consulting role for the company, and called the new licensing deal with Bally as part of Sega's entering a new era.
The end of the 80s saw a bit of a seesaw effect for Sega. While the SG-1000 sold, it didn't sell well enough for Gulf and Western, who began to fully divest from the company. In 1984, Nakayama and Rosen, with a bit of financial help from a Japanese software company, CSK Group, set up a buyout of the 91% of Sega Enterprises that Gulf and Western held. Nakayama was installed as CEO of Sega Enterprises. Sega then began to work on the Mark III, or Master System in North America, in 1985. This was an 8-bit system that they hoped would rival Nintendo's Famicom, and was released in Japan the same year they began development. The Mark III was, hardware-wise, a mighty powerful machine, but its catalog of games was minimal, mostly due to Nintendo's licensing practices with third-party developers. Nintendo was notorious for very strict licensing agreements with third parties, including the requirement that they could not develop the same game for a different system, and a special chip that only played Nintendo Seal of Quality embossed cartridges. Sega tried to remedy this by developing their own games or trying to port titles for the system. This was ultimately unsuccessful, and Sega decided to re-enter the arcade market while there was a renaissance of arcade gaming in North America.
It would be 4 years before Sega decided to try its hand at the home console market again, where it would be overshadowed by the competition once more. In 1988, Sega released the Mega Drive in Japan. Despite positive coverage from trade magazines like Famitsu and Beep, the system only managed to sell 400,000 units. But that tends to happen when Super Mario Bros. 3 was released a week before. It struggled to compete with the Famicom, even though it was a significantly more advanced system. Mega Drive was one of the earliest entries in the new 16-bit console standard, and Famicom was still working with the 8-bit processors, but Sega wasn't going to let that deter them from re-entering the American markets after the NES resurrected home consoles. Changing the name of the system to Genesis, Sega launched their 16-bit system starting in New York and LA on August 14, 1989. Michael Katz, whose long list of positions includes C-suite positions in Coleco and Atari, was serving as the new Sega of America president, and he tried a two-part strategy that included more visible marketing, like the slogan "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," and creating new franchises with the names of celebrities like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker or Joe Montana Football. But with the 4-year head start and ownership of many arcade game console rights, Nintendo continued to dominate the market. Nakayama had given Katz the task of selling 1 million units in the first year. It was a high demand and ultimately was unreachable as the system only sold 500,000 units. Katz would remain in the job for about a year and a half before Nakayama found himself a man that could turn everything around. Under new management. By 1990, the brass of Sega's home office, Sega of Japan for future clarity, was frustrated about the slow sales and lack of presence in the home console market, especially in the US. They wanted more. They also wanted to fight. But it became clear that Sega of America president Michael Katz was not a wartime president, and that was the role that Nakayama needed to go toe-to-toe with Nintendo. So Nakayama traveled to Hawaii in the mid-1990s to try to recruit recently released and still on vacation Matchbox CEO Tom Kalinske. Kalinske had a long history of successfully leading companies. Before serving as CEO of Matchbox, he worked at Mattel for 15 years, where he was credited with reviving the Barbie and Hot Wheels brand before launching the Masters of the Universe franchise. By 1985, the string of success led him to the corner office when he was promoted to CEO of Mattel. He served in this role for 2 years before he left for the rival. In the 3 years he was at Matchbox, he was able to turn a profit for the company for the first time in several years. But his time with Matchbox, though successful, wasn't exactly what Kalinske was looking for. And after an unfortunate trip to Spain, that included counterfeit Matchbox cars, Kalinske was ready to make the next move and left in 1990. To reset after his mid-year departure, Kalinske took his family on a vacation to Hawaii. A vacation that Hayao Nakayama decided to crash to offer Kalinske a job, right there on the sands of the beach. Although Kalinske was apprehensive at first, partially because of the leftover feelings about the departure from Matchbox, as well as his limited knowledge of the video game market, he did take Nakayama up on his offer to travel to the world headquarters in Tokyo, Japan, and see what Sega was all about. The trip to Japan impressed Kalinske, seeing the Game Gear, Sega's handheld system to rival the Game Boy, and finally the Genesis. He was still leery about taking the job, though. He needed some insurance from Nakayama. The biggest was that Kalinske wanted Sega of America to be independent, or at least be able to make decisions without always having to travel to Japan to ask for permission. He didn't want to have to play office politics to get things done. He had that issue at Mattel, which played the largest role in speeding up his exit. Putting a lot of effort into something only to get your legs swept out from underneath you wasn't something he wished to do again. Nakayama gave him the assurance, and Tom Kalinske became the new CEO of Sega of America. It didn't take Kalinske very long to see what kind of shaky operation Sega of America was running. Headquartered out of a warehouse in Hawthorne, California, the overall organization of SOA was rather small compared to its Japanese cousin. One of the few people that Kalinske met on that first day was Shinobu Toyoda. He acted as the executive vice president and liaison between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. Toyoda would become an instrumental member of Kalinske's team in the coming years, but at that moment, Tom was still getting a read of the man. In his first and rather chaotic meeting for the company, and after he established that he was merely an observer for the proceedings, Kalinske had concluded that 2 more members of his current iteration of Sega of America were worthy of maintaining their current spots. Paul Ryo, who had worked with Kalinske before at Mattel in a management position and now was serving as executive vice president, and Al Nilsson, a marketing maestro who would soon be responsible for organizing Sega's most successful marketing campaigns. Mr. Needlemouse and a Pivot. Kalinske was also in the position of figuring out what to do with the new mascot for the company, with very little input beforehand. During Michael Katz's tenure, there was a discussion of a character that they could make a game for that could rival Nintendo's Mario.
Now on his third named title, Nintendo and Mario were practically synonymous. Many at Sega felt that the lack of a mascot was the reason for their marketing woes. After an internal contest, the winner turned out to be a teal hedgehog with red shoes named Mr. Needlemouse, which itself is a literal translation of the Japanese word for hedgehog. With fangs, a biker jacket, and a girlfriend named Madonna, the original Mr. Needlemouse design was all systems go for Sega of Japan. For Kalinske and the team at SOA, this was less than stellar. The team knew that this wasn't going to do very well in the States, and wanted to make their opinion known when they faxed revisions back across the Pacific. Some changes included nixing most of the initial design for a more simplistic look and playing off of the initially described gameplay of the character. The team also used the name Sonic. Nakayama would let Tom know that the design team at SOJ wasn't the happiest about the new redesign, but Kalinske went to the mat for his team. Sending his product manager Madeline Schroeder, SOA put up a defense of the less biker gang representation of the character, which would end up being the final look of Sega's new mascot. When the game had been finished and Kalinske put out a few fires, like EA reverse engineering the Genesis and forcing Sega into a few concessions, and Walmart refusing to put the system on their shelves, the team went to Japan to deliver what would be the path Tom and the others wished to take Sega on. He delivered a 4-point plan to the board in Tokyo. 1. The most controversial of these points was the game bundling. At the time, the new Sega Genesis system came bundled with the middling arcade game Altered Beasts. The game was fine, but like most arcade games, it was repetitive and didn't really flex the muscles of what the system could do. There was also marketing issues with the title, given the implication the game might be tied to anything occult, despite that not being the case. So the decision was to switch Altered Beasts with the new Sega the Hedgehog title. It would cost quite a bit, but the return on the investment would be substantial. 2. The price also needed to come down. Kalinske was a student of the Gillette philosophy of sales. Give the razor away, then sell them the blades. And with 30% of American homes already owning an NES, they needed to get the razors in a lot of hands. A price drop from the $189 price to $149. This would also allow consumers more savings to buy the games and make up for any losses, as well as look more fiscally responsible than Nintendo's 16-bit console, which could be any day now. 3. Marketing was to be revamped, focusing on an entirely new demographic to video games. Everybody that wasn't a kid. Nintendo cornered the market on kids and families, a stigma that has lasted until today, but very little was being done to market to older, more mature gamers. 4. The last change Kalinske wanted to implement was having more game development, especially outside of Japan. Tom and the team knew that SOJ made great games, but the appeal of those games were too often aimed at Asian audiences. This was also something Nintendo was critiqued for. The team felt that you had to give American developers the chance to sell your games if you wanted to make a dent in the American markets.
With Shinobu Toyoda acting as his interpreter and right-hand man for the pitch, Kalinske was aware that most of what he wanted to do was not taken well by the board. With the anger, confusion, and fear the board was exhibiting, Tom knew they weren't convinced. But he wasn't necessarily trying to convince the board, he was trying to convince the one person at the end of the table. At the end of the presentation, Hayao Nakayama would give Tom and SOA team their blessing in needing to get everything in motion.
Now starting with the implementation of that new strategy, Kalinske and his team had a rather large hurdle with the Genesis not being in enough stores. If you don't have a store willing to sell the, quote, razors, to recall Kalinske's philosophy, the consumer can't buy more, quote, blades. And one of the biggest retailers standing in the way was Walmart. After another visit to the Walmart headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, and another denial of getting the Genesis onto the shelves, Kalinske and marketing whiz Al Nielsen decided on something absurd. They were going to make Bentonville Segaville. They invested in billboards all over the city. An entire strip mall was turned into a free Sega arcade. If Walmart didn't notice how much Genesis had to offer from Kalinske's pitch, then they would see it in real time just down the street. But during the months leading to the Consumer Electronics Show set to be held in Chicago that summer, there wasn't a lot of payout for this particular stunt, and with not enough firepower to take a shot at Nintendo this CES, the team will have to wait until winter CES to really throw that first punch and try to take the holiday season. No summer vacation. So while Sega was turning Bentonville into its company town,
Nintendo was starting to see a storm on the horizon. Kalinske had a reputation for success, but the main focus they had was on getting the Super Famicom, or the Super Nintendo in the US, ready for the summer CES in Chicago. The Super Nintendo was presented and given a date in August for its release. The system was impressive, but wouldn't have much to play at the time of launch, with the lack of backward compatibility being a large downside to the product. There were whispers that there might be more for the market leader to announce during the show, so the expectations were high, especially for a former physicist named Olaf Olofsson, who had been serving as Sony's electronic publishing head and facilitating several meetings with Nintendo of America's top brass. Before CES, Olofsson was working with Nintendo to collaborate with Sony in developing a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo to be released in 1992. CDs were quickly becoming more than just a fad, and Sony already had noted success in the market, so it felt like a match. And when the time came for Nintendo to announce their partnership for the CD venture, the hall was shocked that Philips was the choice going forward, and not Sony. Ultimately, even this partnership would break down, leading Philips to create the CDI independently with some of Nintendo's most valued intellectual property, notably the Mario and Legend of Zelda series. Also notably, the Philips CDI was a massive failure and was an objectively bad system. Sega did their best to steal a little of Nintendo's thunder, showcasing their 16-bit system, which was $50 less than the competitor, with the cool blue Hedgehog teasing a future game. They also touted their new handheld system. Set to rival Nintendo's Game Boy, the Game Gear was another powerful piece of equipment from the company. With 8-bit graphics and a backlit screen, the company had also produced a good amount of add-ons for the system, like turning it into a portable antenna TV. If only the thing was a little smaller and didn't need to constantly eat 6 AA batteries, Sega might have had a strong competitor to the Game Boy. And with CES coming to a close, and a deadline for when Nintendo would enter the 16-bit market in earnest, Kalinske and the team at Sega had 16 weeks to build up a marketing campaign that they hoped would get them a solid payout that holiday season. The team started by shifting its audience to older teens and also adults that might be playing video games, with their being cool marketing campaigns and strategic product placement in shows like Saved by the Bell. The team tried to evoke a feeling that Nintendo was really for kids, and that if you wanted to be taken seriously, you had to upgrade. And then came the release of Sonic. Video games didn't have a specific date that they would have been released yet, so Sega was slowly releasing the game through the new bundle that they had planned before, as well as giving people who had already purchased the Genesis the opportunity to buy the game in store. In the weeks that followed, sales for the Genesis would quadruple, and the whole summer Nintendo had one scandal after another, including losing a copyright case against the company that made the Game Genie, a cheat cartridge that would be able to alter the game to players' advantage. And with nothing new to change the story, Nintendo had to just wait until their system came out in August, and they had to watch Sega begin their, quote, world tour. Thanks to Il Nilsson's recommendation and request, Sega was able to add the marketing prowess of Ellen Beth Van Buskirk, who often went by Evie Beavie for brevity's sake, who also brought in members of her successful PR firm. Evie Beavie was one of the leaders of the Sega World Tour that was being planned, setting up kiosks in malls all across the country to do a taste test of the SNES playing Mario and Genesis playing Sonic. And all of this only got bigger when Nilsson was able to add Nickelodeon as a sponsor, so that they could, quote, borrow their cool. EBVB would continue to work with Sega by helping spearhead another massive marketing campaign, but that comes later. They first needed to celebrate. All of the effort of the summer paid off.
That holiday season, the Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo for the first time. And while this was an achievement, many of the Sega management team felt that there was an asterisk on this particular outcome. The Super Nintendo had really only been available for a few months, while Sega had an entire year of sales. Entering the holiday season, people would have had much longer time to talk about the Genesis and planning their future gifts. They needed something big when the two systems would go head-to-head next year. Both companies knew they were in the trenches.
For me, it was Tuesday. The start of 1992 appeared to be the calm before the storm for the battle between these two companies. Sega was busy at work with the second Sonic the Hedgehog game, securing a frustrated and underappreciated Yuji Naka, the main programmer for both the first and current Sonic games, from their counterparts in Japan. It wasn't the first time that Japan had caused a bit of a rough patch for SOA. With their steadfast control over hardware development and the subtle undercuts of SOA's desire to adapt to the US markets, Kalinske and his team were frustrated by their Japanese parent company. But it didn't really shake them too much, mostly because they had too much work to do. Al Nilsson and the marketing team kicked around a bunch of different ideas to get the world ready for Sonic 2. It also didn't help that Naka and his team were still working on the game, already having to delay it from October to November. But heading into the summer, and to their own expo set in Florida to try and convince retailers of the quality of the products, Sega had figured out the best plan for the newest Blue Blur's adventure, Sonic Tuesday.
On its face, it looked like a typical marketing gimmick. With all of the puns on the number 2 flying around on the stage in Boca Raton, I'm sure the marketing team was nervous that they wouldn't be taken seriously. Yet, when the plan was unveiled, there was some excitement that made the audience forget all of the silly instances of there being too many puns. I'm sorry.
Earlier, I talked about how video games were typically released in steps. Sega wanted to shake that up and make Sonic Tuesday a worldwide release of the new Sonic 2 game. There still wasn't a set date, but they knew, or more hoped, that it would be ready by November, just in time for the Christmas season. Sega also prepared for the launch with the introduction of a new ad campaign. With their Welcome to the Next Level campaign, Sega reached out to a demographic that felt the most pushed aside by video games, everyone that wasn't a child. The marketing team saw a real opportunity of painting Nintendo not just as family-friendly, but boring and lame. By creating commercials that showcased the games and their visual qualities, there were also the supersonic speed of cuts and flashes of action that were very much aimed at an older audience, an anti-establishment audience. It was from this campaign that Sega utilized one of its most consistent tools to get a customer, in their words, revved up, the Sega Scream. Sega! And for Nintendo's part, they didn't fall asleep at the wheel while their competitors unleashed this marketing blitz. First, they bought a baseball team. The Seattle Mariners had 2 choices, get bought out or move to Florida. While the Mariners weren't as good as Seattle wanted them to be, it was still their team. Minoru Arakawa, president of Nintendo of America and son-in-law to Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, saw an opportunity for Nintendo to keep the Mariners in Washington and be folk heroes to their fans. With the help of 6 other leaders of Seattle businesses, the Seattle Mariners had new ownership. At that summer's CES in Chicago, Nintendo shook Sega a bit when they announced a pretty substantial price drop for the SNES. A system bundled with Super Mario World would be sold for $129.95, and if someone just wanted the system, it would only cost them $99.95. Lower pricing had always been the advantage of Sega, but they now had the more expensive of the systems. Kalinsky and his team scrambled to try and find a way to bring down the price of the Genesis as well, but this wasn't a decision that they could make on their own. They needed the approval of Nakayama and Sega of Japan, which the relationship had become more and more strained as the year progressed. But they were given the okay to lower the price and match Nintendo's core system pricing of $99.95. Maybe this allowance was given with the projected success of the new Sega CD, a peripheral system that connected the Genesis and would play CD-based video games. It had been available in Japan for about a year, and the Sega team was looking to have a release date for the US edition in the fall. In the offices of Sega, there was excitement about the dual release of the Sega CD and Sonic 2. Nintendo was busy with its own marketing campaign with the showcases of the SNES's Mode 7, a graphics mode that allowed background layers to rotate scaled down, simulating 3 dimensions in a game. This mode had been used to great effect in games like Super Mario Kart, but Nintendo was anxious that the Sega CD would surpass them in hardware. With the release of the Super FX chip, Nintendo brass felt they had a product that could go toe-to-toe with Sega's hardware. As for software, Nintendo had the benefit of working with Capcom to port one of the most popular games in the last few years with Street Fighter II. Street Fighter quickly became the company's most popular game for a spell. It was now the Sega team's turn to be more anxious after the sophistication of the SNES was unveiled, but Kalinsky was in talks with Olaf Olafsson from Sony Digital Publishing. Olafsson, watching the marketing bout between Sega and Nintendo, was looking to see if at least this company would work with them in developing a CD peripheral, or even a new system altogether. But Sony was a large company for a reason, hedging their bets on the American gaming market by also starting backup talks with Nintendo. But however Kalinsky and company were feeling about their hardware, they were sure Sonic would be the champion against Street Fighter. For the release of Sonic 2 on Sonic Tuesday, the Sega of American team were set for the coordinated release, even if Sega of Japan decided they just wanted to release the game when they wanted to. While that frustration from SOA towards SOJ was just simmering under the surface, this brought it just a bit closer to a rolling boil. But Sonic Tuesday and Sonic 2 was a runaway success, leading to Sega matching the SNES's sale that holiday season. Success from that game was felt throughout the SOA headquarters halls, yet they were unaware of what was coming further into the calendar, and something wicked this way comes. That game's a lot. Maybe too much. Heading into the summer of '93, Sega stood at a crossroad. At that upcoming CES, Midway had just previewed a new fighting game, and the team was divided on what to do. Given that the game, Mortal Kombat, was a vast departure from the typical fare consumers would get from video games, it made sense that some of the team opted either to publish it without the violence, or some saying to not publish the game at all. Nintendo was having a similar battle amongst its ranks, some wanting to shake that, quote, family-friendly funk, and others being quite content with how the company functioned. Mortal Kombat was released for both the SNES and Genesis. What made the dual release significant was that depending on which system you owned, you would get a pretty different experience, just not in the typical way these two systems differed. For a little background, Mortal Kombat was an arcade fighting game like Street Fighter II. Mortal Kombat was also exceptionally more violent than most games released by now, with blood flying from combatants and the noted, quote, fatality move, very much unlike Street Fighter. Parents were already aware of the violence of this game, and many preferred to stay in the arcades and not enter their home, thank you very much. But both Nintendo and Sega saw dollar signs among the graphics and tried to figure out ways to get it on their systems. Sega, in an attempt to give parents a heads up, but mostly to CYA, organized the three-step rating system and council for video games. GA, general audiences, MA13, mature audiences, and MA17, adults only. But Klinsky and his team were concerned about giving the harshest rating for what would likely be their most profitable game of the season, so a stopgap measure was the, quote, blood code, a specific sequence of buttons a player would hit. None of the blood would be in the initial release, but when the player input a code through the control, the game would be displayed with all of its gory glory. Nintendo, on the other hand, made a conscious decision to release Mortal Kombat with no blood at all. Instead, they changed the color of the blood to gray and called it sweat, and many of the more violent fatalities were replaced or omitted altogether. Parents were grateful, if only marginally, for Nintendo's decision to do this. It also played right into the marketing of Sega, still portraying Nintendo as the, quote, kids' table for games. Sega attempted to give parents a heads up about the games they were getting for their children with their rating system, but with the additional release of Night Trap for the Sega CDI, a rather mature game that utilized live-action sequences with the gameplay, Sega, and the industry as a whole, was under the scrutiny of something large and powerful, the United States government. In December of 1993 and March of 1994, the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs and the Judicial Committee, led by Senators Joe Lieberman and Herb Kohl, scheduled hearings to investigate the perceived impacts violence in video games had on children. Gun violence had risen in the country, and Lieberman was made aware of the violence in video games after he was notified by a former chief of staff. After the committee heard testimony from experts in education and children's psychology, both Sega and Nintendo sent representatives for the second half of the hearings. The hearings only made the rivalry more contentious between the two companies. Sega's representative was Bill White, who had worked with Nintendo for a long time until he switched sides in 1993. He positioned the decision of Sega to make and publish games like Night Trap because the intent for these games was for an adult audience. Video games weren't just for children anymore, and Sega was delivering more mature content to a more mature audience. Long-serving VP of Nintendo of America, Howard Lincoln, vehemently disagreed with the position, stating, quote, I can't just sit here and allow you to be told that the video game industry has been transformed from children as a primary consumer to adults, end quote. White countered with statistics from warranty cards that both companies would have to collect to show the shift of age demographic, which Nintendo planned accordingly for with lifelike light gun periphery. But Sega had also created the rating systems for the game after entries like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap were released, per Lincoln. The two would go back and forth about the perceived distress the games had on children and the ongoing intent of the video game industry. All of this culminated in the Video Game Rating Act of 1994, which established the Interactive Entertainment Rating Council. This was a 5-member panel that was appointed by the president and would coordinate with the video game industry to develop a rating system that appeared more thorough for potential consumers. Eventually, all of this would lead to the formation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, ESRB, which still functions in this capacity to this day. Friendly Fire and Endgame.
After the hearings and all of the coverage that they had received, SOA was starting to feel some of the pressure. Many of the original team Klinsky had relied on had left for other things, and Sega of Japan was not making it easier. From when Olaf Olafsson entered back into the co-development fray with both Nintendo and Sega, it was clear that Olafsson was leaning Sega's way. But when it seemed like a done deal, Sega of Japan backed out, leading to another instance of Sony being left at the altar. This, in the end, would be a devastating decision. Kalinske was moving from frustrated to angry at SOJ's decisions, and felt like his parent company was trying to tank them. Whether it was out of spite or a difference of opinions, Kalinske would never know. Meanwhile, Nintendo was once again king of the mountain. The summer of '94 saw the announcement of Donkey Kong Country, a game developed by an up-and-coming British studio named Rare. The game was revolutionary in the design and implementation of its graphics and sound, as well as being a really fun game to play. After its release that fall, Nintendo was feeling like their old selves again, and felt more comfortable as they continued to design their next system, one that was 64-bit that would eventually become the N64. Sega was also beginning the development of a new system, one that excluded Sony and almost all of the feedback from SOA. The Sega Saturn, it would eventually be called, was a CD-based 32-bit system that Kalinske saw as being more trouble than it was worth. The development was rushed, mostly due to the rumblings of the new Nintendo system coming out soon, and not many developers were ready to make any games for it. So upon its release in the US in 1995, most of the games available were Sega arcade ports. But Kalinske and what was left of the original Sonic team had to get through summer of '95's CES, talking big about their new system and the future of Sega. But that CES would be the harbinger for Kalinske's tenure as president of Sega of America. The final strike that took out Kalinske, and eventually Sega as a hardware developer, didn't come from their longtime rivals from Seattle. Nintendo would also see the front of a new war when former Sega sales executive Steve Race would take the stage to present a new system from a new entrant to the video game fray, Sony. Since Sega of Japan pulled out of the deal to collaborate with Sony on a new system, they had been in development of their own system, from the bottom up, introducing the PlayStation at CES 95, showing Kalinske and Nintendo that they fought valiantly, but they were no longer in the same game anymore. 10 months later, Kalinske would resign from his position as president of Sega of America. By the end of 2000s, after one more console failed to have the same pull as Genesis, Sega would pull out of the console development game altogether, focusing instead on software. They continue to produce software to this day, including some in collaboration with a former market enemy. After the N64 and PS1 would fight for the market share, Nintendo would be the observers of another console war that would be waged during the next generation of gaming, with the PS2 and the Xbox duking it out, despite having a new system of their own. It's hard not to see the end of the great console war as Sega making a few unforced errors, but that's a disservice to the management team that really wanted to make a good product, and they also wanted to knock down a competitor that was perceived as too big to fail. But really, it's more of a tortoise and the hare situation. But I think the best way to look at the console war is that the real winners were the gamers. Every year the games got better and better and better. These were systems that defined childhoods, so it's clear that if we're going to talk about the history of video games, you can't tell it fully without talking about the console war.